Tell him how you feel. Who taught you to hate yourself?
By any means necessary.
Every single time there's been a great revolutionary leader or thinker, they've always been surrounded by controversy. Now, whether this controversy is justified or true, or whether it's just a construct of the power structure that's looking to discredit their message, we'll never really know. Do you guys ever wonder why we weren't taught about Malcolm X in school? How could somebody that's given so much, that's done so much, and that has spoken up so much for the community be so overlooked when it comes to the history books? The first reason was because he didn't believe in a non-violent passive resistance, which at the time was led by the civil rights movement. Rather, he believed in defending yourself and striving for justice by any means necessary.
When someone comes at you with a club, when someone comes at you with a rope, when someone comes at you with a gun, despite the fact that you've done nothing, he tells you, suffer peacefully. Pray for those who use you despitefully. Be long-suffering. And how long can you suffer after suffering for 400 years?
The second reason was because he spoke truth to power without any hesitation, and in the process he made a lot of enemies and stirred up a lot of controversy.
What is your real name?
Malcolm X.
Is that your legal name?
As far as I'm concerned, it's my legal name. That during slavery, the same slave master who owned us put his last name on us to denote that we were his property. So that when you see a Negro today who's named Johnson, if you go back in his history, you'll find that he was once his grandfather, or one of his forefathers was owned by a white man who was named Johnson.
Would you mind telling me what your father's last name was?
My father didn't know his last name. My father got his last name from his grandfather, and his grandfather got it from his grandfather, who got it from the slave master. The real names of our people were destroyed during slavery.
He called out black leaders who he thought were Uncle Toms or sellouts or traitors to their race. But he didn't criticize anybody more than he criticized the white liberal or the white Democrat, who he thought only posed to be the friends of the black community, but were never anywhere to be found when it mattered. The third reason was because he was a man who identified with his roots and culture in Africa more than he did with his Americanism. And he taught people that they should reconnect with their roots, which was a threat to the idea of American exceptionalism, which the government was and still is trying to push till this day. The FBI was following Malcolm X very, very closely. In a released FBI document from 1955, which was actually a couple of years before he was even known on a global scale, J. Edgar Hoover and his boys were already sending notes to each other discussing the threat that was Malcolm X. In view of the subject's long active membership in the MCI and his positions as minister of the MCI, as well as his speeches and statements against the US government, it is believed that he can possibly commit acts inimical to the national defense and public safety in a time of emergency. Therefore, it is recommended that his name be retained on the security index. Basically, this Malcolm X guy could potentially be dangerous, and we should put him on our watch list. These FBI reports on Malcolm X were very, very detailed. They had personal letters that he sent out and received. They tapped his phone. They knew where he went when he traveled, who he met with. I mean, this was 60 years ago, and they were doing this type of thing. Could you imagine what kind of stuff they're doing now? Anyways, Malcolm X didn't see himself as an American. He said that if his people were actually considered to be American, then they wouldn't need any new civil rights laws to be passed, as there are enough laws in the American law book which defend the rights of an American citizen. So by fighting for new laws, essentially there's an admission that they are not regarded as American citizens. And so that was his conclusion. He was an American.
If the white people really passed meaningful laws, it would not be necessary to pass any more laws. There are already enough laws on the law books to protect an American citizen. You only need additional laws when you're dealing with someone who is not regarded as an American citizen. But whites are so hypocritical. They don't want to admit that this black man is not a citizen. So they classify him as a second-class citizen to get around making him a real citizen. If he was a real citizen, you'd need no more laws. You'd need no civil rights legislation. Civil rights, when you have civil rights, you have citizenship. It's automatic. White people don't need laws to protect their citizenship because they're citizens. But they don't want to tell us we're not citizens. And at the same time, they don't want to pass laws that are meaningful enough to protect us as if we were citizens.
He spoke of the history of his people, how they were kidnapped from Africa, enslaved in America. He spoke of how they were ripped away from their culture, their history, their roots, their language, their identity. This colonial story is always the same, wherever you go to hear it. The colonizer will always try to erase the history and identity of the colonized. They stop you from practicing your religion and your culture. They destroy your history books and give you theirs. They stop you from speaking your language. They kidnap children from their parents and they raise them to fit their newly colonized societies. It's always the same story.
If you say that you're fed up, if you teach the Negroes, people don't even know their own name. Why? Because he took it away from them. Please. 20 million black people don't even know their own language. Why? Because he took it away from them. 20 million black people who don't even know the history of their ancestors. Why? Because he took it away from them.
He tried, however, to raise the awareness of his community on the importance of reconnecting yourself to your roots, as it's crucial to your identity as a human being. A plant that has been ripped out of its roots will quickly die. Similarly, a human being who has been disconnected from their roots is essentially as good as dead. The emphasis he made on reclaiming the identity of his people threatened the idea of American exceptionalism. This was very dangerous to them because then how else are they going to convince them to fight their wars, pay their taxes, follow their laws, conform to their authority? If they didn't regard themselves as American, then why would they follow anything? That's why the power structure leaned towards other leaders who spoke of demanding your rights as an American. Now, although the white power structure didn't want to give them their rights, they were still happy that they were regarding themselves as American citizens or as Americans. In speaking truth to power, Malcolm X was calling out the white liberals just as much as he was calling out the white Republicans. This was one of the biggest reasons why the mainstream media, even till this day, chose to focus on other leaders from that time when it comes to Black History Month. Obviously, the Democrats aren't going to push or endorse any figure from that time that was publicly calling them out. It's politics. When Obama got into office in 2008 as the leader of the Democratic Party, he actually put up a statue of Martin Luther King in the Oval Office. It was very clear who the Democratic Party elected to go with as their go-to guy for Black History Month. And it definitely wasn't going to be the guy who was calling them out on their empty words and false promises back in the 1960s. I find this funny actually, because as an Arab Muslim living in Canada, we were always very inclined to vote for liberals. They would throw their empty words and make an appearance at our mosque every once in a while, and that's all they had to do to secure our votes every election. But when it came to actual policy or change, there was never anything done that was meaningful which actually benefited the Muslim or Arab communities. Simply put, Malcolm X saw through the theatrics of the Democrats or the liberals and was able to call them out on it when he didn't see much results or change as a result of their quote-unquote support. Going back to the FBI records, you can see how closely they were surveilling Malcolm X. They actually knew that there was going to be an attempt made on his life. The FBI records show that they knew that there was growing tensions between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, and they actually used it to their advantage. Funny enough, in early FBI reports, you can even see notes that were being sent off to J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI at the time, talking about how Malcolm X needs to be taken care of before, quote, it's too late. Whatever that means. We all know what that means. Malcolm X's death was of benefit to the power structure, and so they sat back and watched it happen. And afterwards, they knowingly arrested the wrong people. And it wasn't until 2020 that the rulings on the individuals who were convicted were overturned, after they had spent 2 decades in prison. Now, had Malcolm X sold out like some of the other leaders, or had he eased his message to conform with the power structure, then perhaps the FBI would have made a greater effort to save his life when they found out that his life was actually in danger. He wasn't just fighting to sit next to white people on the bus or at a restaurant. He wasn't fighting to get himself or a few people into a white school or sit on a white toilet. Malcolm X viewed equality as beyond having access to the same public resources or getting crumbs from the white power structure. Malcolm X viewed equality as taking control of your community through education, economy, politics, and employment. He believed in a do-it-yourself, for yourself, and by yourself philosophy.
The of black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. We must understand the politics of our community, and we must know what politics is supposed to produce. The economic philosophy of black nationalism only means that we should own and operate and control the economy of our community. The economic philosophy of black nationalism only means that we have to become involved in a program of re-education to educate our people into the importance of knowing that when you spend your dollar out of the community in which you live, the community in which you spend your money becomes richer and richer. The community out of which you take your money becomes poorer and poorer. And because these Negroes who have been misled, misguided, are breaking their necks to take their money and spend it with the man is becoming richer and richer, and you're becoming poorer and poorer.
He said that once his community was able to stand on its own 2 feet and sustain itself without any assistance or dependence on anything outside of the community, through the means that I just listed, then they would find themselves in a position where they wouldn't need to beg the white power structure for anything. And at that point, they would become equals and they would be able to build a relationship based on equal terms moving forward. But he said that as long as they approached the white community to solve their issues, they would never get the justice they deserved. He believed in taking the American race issue to the United Nations, as he said that America wasn't capable of dealing with this issue objectively. You can't get justice in the courts of the person that's inflicting the injustices on you.
Of the black man in America is beyond America's ability to solve. It's a human problem, not an American problem or a Negro problem. And as a human problem or a world problem, we feel that it should be taken out of the jurisdiction of the United States government and the United States courts and taken into the United Nations. And
it's like the Palestinians who are trying to get justice in the Israeli court system. They will never get justice because the Israeli judge will always rule in favor of the Israeli. Justice is good news for the oppressed, but it's never good news for the oppressor. What's good for the sheep is never good for the wolf. In his travels, he made a lot of international connections in the Middle East, in Africa, and Latin America. He became almost like an ambassador for the people. And he would have garnered so much international support had he lived long enough to take the plight of the black Americans to the international high courts. His message was never published in full. They only focused on what they referred to as the doctrine of hate or doctrine of violence. He did not think that a non-violent approach would work against an enemy that only speaks the language of violence. He preached that violence used in self-defense was the right of every single human being, and it should be exercised to the fullest degree in the event that there is a threat made on your life, which for black people in America was a constant reality. This methodology made a lot of white people in America feel very uncomfortable and very threatened. They would much rather hear somebody talking about turning the other cheek and loving your enemy and a peaceful, non-violent resistance to their oppression and tyranny. That would make them feel a lot more comfortable. But this guy talking about how he wanted to stand up for himself and stand up for his people, they just couldn't handle it.
They should have the right to defend themselves against any attack made against them by anyone. If a dog is biting a black man, the black man should kill the dog. Whether the dog is a police dog, a hound dog, or any kind of dog. If a dog is sick on a black man, when that black man is doing nothing but trying to take advantage of what the government says is supposed to be his, then that black man should kill that dog or any two-legged dog who sicks the dog on it.
Whenever we're taught about great figures in history, we often think that the struggles that they faced remain in history with them. These figures usually get watered down over time, and we're led to believe that the thing which they fought for has been realized or achieved. What makes Malcolm X a special figure is that through hearing him speak, you begin to realize that the struggles he's bringing attention to aren't just unique to his time, but the issues he's bringing attention to are very much alive in our societies today. All you have to do is simply open your eyes, look around, and see them. Beyond that, you find that his methods and his teachings are still very applicable in the pursuit of justice and freedom. They don't teach about Malcolm X in school because the power structure was unable to minimize or reconstruct his image or message. He was not a figure that could be watered down. If you know your roots, then you know yourself. And if you know yourself, then you know where you stand. And if you know where you stand, then you cannot be used, misled, or tricked into blindly following whatever agenda is being pushed. That's the power of free thought. He was unapologetic in his pursuit of truth, justice, and freedom. He opened a door that still to this day cannot be closed. A door of inquiry, of critical thinking, and of a desire for justice. A door which today you and I can walk through because of figures like Malcolm X.
Assalamu alaikum.
Mr. Moderator, our distinguished guests, brothers and sisters, our friends and our enemies. Everybody is here.